At a moment when the culture is being asked to trade legacy for likes, receipts for reposts, and 40 years of global earthquake for one screenshot from an Apple Music dashboard, Drake and his fan base have officially crossed the line that separates a record from a takeover. Because as of this week, Drake has done it. He has passed the man. He has passed Michael Jackson on the Billboard Hot 100 for the most #1 singles by a male solo artist in the history of the chart, and if you have logged onto any timeline in the last 72 hours, you already know his people are treating it like the coronation of a new king. But before anybody hands Drake the crown, before anybody chisels his face into the Mount Rushmore of pop, we need to have an honest, forensic, unflinching conversation about what this record actually is, what it is not, and why the loudest celebration on the internet right now is being run by the most historically illiterate fan base in modern music. Now let me be clear on one thing up front, so nobody can twist the message. This is not a hate piece on Drake. Drake is one of the most commercially dominant artists this century has produced, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. This is about the framing. This is about the noise. This is about the difference between a statistic and a legacy, and the fact that Drake's own camp has spent the last several days deliberately blurring that line to rewrite a story that the numbers alone cannot rewrite. Because once you actually strip the paint off this so-called record, you find something a lot more uncomfortable than the fans want to admit. Off camera, while Drake was uploading his celebration graphics, Billboard quietly published the full context of the number, and that context matters more than the headline. Michael Jackson earned 13 #1 singles as a solo artist. 13. Every single one of them credited to him, and only him, on the label copy. No feature credit doing the heavy lifting. No Atlanta stopover to borrow somebody else's audience. 13 solo records, delivered in an era when a hit meant physical scanners at retail counters, radio spins measured by human ears, and a music video premiere on network television that could freeze the whole country in place. Drake, meanwhile, sits at 14. And of those 14, only 6 are true solo entries. 6. The rest are features, collaborations, and posse cuts where somebody else supplied the wattage. That is not an insult. That is the label copy. Read it yourself. So when Drake's fans post that screenshot and shout that he broke the record, what they are really saying is that a hybrid number was allowed to leapfrog a pure one, and the entire internet is supposed to nod along and pretend the math is the same. It is not the same. It has never been the same. And the moment you point that out, the same fan base that spent 5 years calling everybody else a hater turns around and calls you a hater for reading. That is the first crack in the story. Here's the second. Drake has just released 3 albums back to back to back inside the same rollout, a project he named Iceman, and the sales report on that project tells a story his people do not want in the timeline. Drake sold roughly 13,000 pure copies of one of those albums in a full week. 13,000. A number so small that independent artists on Bandcamp have posted higher counts on a slow Tuesday. And this is the same Drake his fans call the biggest artist in the world. This is the same Drake they claim is carrying the entire game. This is the same Drake whose stans went on the internet to yell that Michael Jackson could never do what he is doing right now, while their king is out here moving fewer physical units than a mid-tier vinyl reissue. Now compare that to the era Michael Jackson operated in. Michael Jackson would sell 13,000 units in the time it took him to change outfits. Michael Jackson sold 20 million copies of Thriller in a single year in America alone. Michael Jackson moved 105 million copies of that album worldwide, and the number is still climbing 4 decades later because his catalog outlives the calendar. Michael Jackson did that when a fan had to leave the house, drive to a record store, wait in a line, and hand over cash. There was no autoplay. There was no algorithmic playlist. There was no bot farm padding a stream count. There was a human being standing in a Tower Records, choosing him. That is the difference between a number and a movement. That is the difference between a chart position and a cultural event. And that is the difference the modern Drake fan cannot process, because the modern Drake fan has never known a world where music had to prove itself on the ground. Which brings us to the part of this story nobody in Drake's camp is willing to say out loud. The record is not the flex. The record is the confession. Because if a full solo era in 2026, with 3 albums stacked into one release window, with playlist real estate on every major streaming service, with a fan base that treats replaying a song 500 times a day like a religious ritual, only produces 13,000 pure sales, that is not dominance. That is dependence. Dependence on infrastructure that props up numbers, dependence on a machine that inflates streams into equivalents, and dependence on a narrative that his own fans keep polishing because the raw data will not do it for them. The receipts speak louder than the noise. And the receipts say Drake did not out Michael. Drake outlasted a metric, and then a metric got rewritten around him. Let me put it another way, because this is where most of the arguing online goes off the rails. Nobody is saying Drake is not a hitmaker. Nobody is saying he does not make songs that hit. Drake has made bops for 15 years, and pretending he is not is silly. The point is that a hitmaker is not the same thing as a giant. A pop star is not the same thing as a monument. And a streaming record is not the same thing as global hysteria. Michael Jackson stopped traffic on 6 continents. Michael Jackson made the black or white music video an event so large that networks in multiple countries interrupted their programming to premiere it, and it pulled roughly 500 million viewers in a single night before the word streaming even existed. Drake, in 2026, with every algorithmic advantage ever invented, still cannot sell out every stadium on a full world tour. That is not a diss. That is public information. And this is where the honesty test starts for every one of us, because there are 2 very different audiences watching this story unfold. There is the audience that grew up in the physical era, that remembers what it felt like when a song was so big it echoed across every barbershop, every corner store, every school bus. And then there is the audience that grew up inside the app, that measures greatness by a green-up arrow next to a play count. Those 2 audiences are having 2 completely different conversations, and neither of them realizes the other is even in the room. The physical era audience is talking about impact. The app era audience is talking about output. And impact and output are not the same currency. Now let me be fair to the fans defending Drake, because they are not entirely wrong about one thing. It is true that Michael Jackson did not have social media. It is true that Michael Jackson did not have TikTok or Spotify or an Apple Music playlist. And it is fair to say we cannot run a perfect scientific experiment across 2 different eras. Fair enough. But here is the counter that Drake's fans keep dodging. If we're going to say Michael Jackson would have been even bigger with modern tools, then we also have to admit that Drake, without modern tools, would not be Drake. Take away the algorithm. Take away the playlist real estate. Take away the auto-cue. Take away the fan armies running loops in their sleep. What is left? A talented Toronto artist with a Degrassi origin story who would still be very good, but who would not be sitting on top of a chart he only reached because the chart's definition of a hit was quietly rebuilt to include his kind of numbers. This is not a hypothetical. This is a mirror. And when Drake's fans refuse to look into it, they end up doing the one thing that damages his legacy more than any critic ever could. They oversell him. Now step back and look at what the loudest voices in the Drake camp have actually been saying this week, because this is where it gets uncomfortable. They are not just celebrating a record. They are trying to bury a legacy. They are lining up on every platform, quote tweeting Billboard headlines, and telling anybody who mentions Michael Jackson to sit down and be quiet. They are calling MJ's era irrelevant. They are calling 40 years of touring, merchandising, philanthropy, choreography, and cultural earthquake a fluke of a slower news cycle. They are treating the king of pop like an outdated benchmark that got timed out by a firmware update. And that is not fandom. That is revisionism. And revisionism is exactly the kind of behavior that turns a fan base into a case study. The moment the world writes Michael Jackson off is the moment the world tells on itself. Because Michael Jackson is not a chart artifact. Michael Jackson is a load-bearing wall in the entire structure of modern pop music. Every hook Drake ever wrote sits on top of a chord progression that Michael Jackson normalized. Every dance trend Drake ever tried to ride was invented on a stage Michael Jackson built. Every crossover black artist has made into the mainstream pop machine walks across a bridge Michael Jackson laid down brick by brick. To dismiss him because the numbers got easier is to say you do not understand what the numbers were paying for. That is exactly the reason this record does not settle anything. It reframes it. It puts a spotlight on the difference between an artist who moved units and an artist who moved the culture. It puts a spotlight on the difference between a chart record and a chart era. And it puts a spotlight on the deepest and most inconvenient truth in this entire conversation, which is that Drake's problem is not his catalog. Drake's problem is his positioning. He is a pop star operating with a hip-hop identity card, and every time somebody with a real hip-hop passport walks into the room, the paperwork does not check out. You mean to say a pop star can break a pop chart record? Of course he can. Nobody is disputing that. The dispute is what happens after the record breaks, because that is when the fan base tries to import the pop achievement into the hip-hop ledger, and hip-hop is not a chart. Hip-hop is a covenant. Hip-hop is a set of standards, a set of debts, a set of receipts that go back to block parties, to park jams, to boroughs, to neighborhoods that were writing themselves onto tape decks decades before streaming even existed. And you cannot chart your way into that. You have to earn your way into that. Drake was welcomed in with a visitor's pass, and he has spent the last 2 years acting like the deed is in his name. It is not. It has never been. And every time his fans try to hand him one, they make it a little harder for him to ever get one on merit. This is why the Kendrick Lamar aftermath still hangs over every headline like weather. Because when Kendrick Lamar decided to test that visitor's pass, the response he got from Drake's camp told the whole industry that the boy from Toronto was not built for the covenant. And now, more than a year later, the fans are trying to use a Billboard entry to rewrite a battle they already lost. That is not how any of this works. You do not unlose a cultural argument with a data point. You do not unlose an identity fight with a marketing graphic. You do not unlose a legacy conversation by yelling louder in a group chat. And here is where the whole thing gets even messier, because Drake himself keeps feeding the fire. Every time he releases a new project, he goes back to the same script. He plays the victim. He talks about how everybody is against him. He recites the woe is me monologue over a down-tempo instrumental. He tells his audience that the world is unfair, that the industry is rigged against him, that his critics are haters with no argument. And then he prints another chart record and expects his fans to treat the record like proof of righteousness. It is not proof of anything except distribution. And the more he leans on that framing, the more he confirms that the noise around him is louder than the music. Which is exactly why the celebration of this MJ record feels so hollow to anybody paying attention. It is not the record that people are mocking. It is the ceremony. It is the way his stans are treating a hybrid statistic like a holy relic, when the man they are trying to dethrone was pulling 500 million viewers to a single premiere before Drake was old enough to spell his own name. The ceremony does not fit the trophy. The trophy does not fit the god they are comparing him to. And every additional post his fans make trying to force the comparison ends up shrinking their own artist in the process. Now, in fairness, the Drake superfan who does understand the difference is quietly out there. There are Drake fans, real Drake fans, who love his music, who buy his merch, who go to his tours, who defend his catalog with actual arguments, and who still know that Michael Jackson is a different weight class of a different sport. Those fans are not the problem. The problem is the loudest layer of the base, the ones who talk more about streams than songs, the ones who measure greatness in playlist inclusions, the ones who think a screenshot ends an argument. Those fans have taken over the conversation, and they are dragging Drake's public image with them into a place he cannot climb out of on his own. Because at the end of the day, the streaming era is not a legacy machine. It is a distribution machine. It does not make you a giant. It makes you findable. It does not make you an icon. It makes you playable. And the artists who mistake findability for immortality tend to age poorly in exactly the way that Drake is starting to age right now. He is not shrinking as an artist. He is shrinking as a symbol. And symbols, in this business, are the only currency that survives the algorithm. Compare that with Michael Jackson one more time, because the comparison is the whole thesis. Michael Jackson sold merch, movies, video specials, tour DVDs, and an entire live spectacle that traveled from Tokyo to Bucharest and packed stadiums that Drake could not fill on his best day with a free ticket giveaway. Michael Jackson had a full-blown Neverland-sized economy attached to his name. Michael Jackson had physical, tangible, human demand. Drake has streams. And streams, in the ledger of history, are the softest currency ever printed. So no, the record does not settle it. And no, the numbers do not settle it. And no, 13,000 pure sales on a triple album era does not settle it. What settles it is a very simple question that Drake's fans keep refusing to answer. When the servers go down, when the playlists disappear, when the algorithm resets, and the audience actually has to choose whether to leave the house and buy a ticket, a shirt, or a physical copy, who is going to still be on the shelf? Who is going to still be on the wall? Who is going to still be on the merch table? Whose face is going to be on a t-shirt that a teenager in 2055 wears without irony? Because that is the test. That is the only test that has ever mattered in this business. And the moment you apply that test to this MJ comparison, the record collapses under its own weight. Now the honest, unpopular, uncomfortable truth is that this conversation is not really about Michael Jackson. It is not really about Drake either. It is about what kind of listeners we are becoming. Because if the internet can gaslight itself into thinking a hybrid streaming record erases a physical, cultural, generational giant, then we are not listening to music anymore. We are being served content. And once we admit that, everything else in this argument makes sense. The screenshot wars, the playlist ministry, the stan armies, the chart worship. It is all the same story. It is a listenership that has been trained to measure meaning by numbers, and numbers by whoever is willing to pay for the placement. That is exactly the reason MJ still wins this. Not because he is untouchable. Not because Drake is untalented. But because Michael Jackson operated in a marketplace where an audience had to choose him with their feet, their wallets, and their time, and he still moved more of them than anybody in modern pop has moved with a decade of algorithmic tailwind. The moment the world writes him off, the world just tells on itself. And if you are watching this and you are a Drake fan, this is not the part where I tell you to unfollow him or delete Iceman off your phone. Enjoy the music. Enjoy the bops. Enjoy the era. Just do not walk into a legacy conversation with a screenshot and act like the argument is over. It is not over. It has not even started. And the more you try to force it, the more you push Drake further away from the very ceiling you are trying to help him touch. Because here is the last uncomfortable piece of this whole thing. Michael Jackson, if he were alive right now, would not be arguing on the internet about who broke his record. He would be in a studio, in a rehearsal room, in a costume fitting, in a video shoot, in a stadium walkthrough, in a business meeting, quietly building another era that would erase the debate entirely. That is what giants do. Giants do not defend their records. Giants make the next one impossible to catch. Drake could still be that. Drake still has the runway, the resources, the machine, and the ear of a whole generation to make that pivot. But he is not going to be able to do it while his loudest fans are online telling everybody else to be quiet. He is going to have to grow past them. He is going to have to stop feeding the victim script. He is going to have to stop treating every number as a verdict. And most of all, he is going to have to accept that the record he just broke is not the record that history is going to write about him. History is going to write about the era after this one, and whether he chose to be a chart artist for the rest of his career or an actual monument that outlives the algorithm. That is the fork in the road. That is the moment he is actually standing at, whether his fans admit it or not. And that is why this MJ headline, in the end, is not the trophy his camp is trying to sell you. It is a mirror. And what he sees in that mirror over the next 12 months is going to decide everything about how the next 20 years remember him. Now I want to hear from you, because this is the part of the conversation the algorithm always tries to skip. Do you think Drake genuinely surpassed Michael Jackson with this chart record, or do you think the record is a technicality that his fans oversold? Do you think the streaming era should be compared to the physical era at all, or are we watching two entirely different sports get scored on the same scoreboard? Do you think Drake still has time to pivot into a real legacy artist, or has the ceiling already been drawn on him? Drop your honest take in the comments, because the range of answers on this one is going to be wild, and I read every single one of them. And if this conversation hit something for you, if it clarified something you have been trying to put into words for months, do me a favor. Tap subscribe, tap the bell, and share this with the friend who has been arguing about MJ and Drake in your group chat for the last 3 days. Because the next video I am dropping goes even deeper into the sales trickery around the Iceman rollout, and once you see that breakdown, the numbers you have been reading online this week are going to start looking very, very different. So do not miss that one. It is already loaded up right on the screen next to me, and it is the piece that finishes what we started here today. The record broke. The story did not. And the truth, as always, is louder than the trophy.